In this segment, we're going to be talking about the respiratory system. We'll start with functions of the respiratory system, what it's for, and then specifics on one of those functions, gas exchange. We'll talk about the requirements for the surface in gas exchange and how that surface is structured in humans. We'll then start talking about air, what's in the air, and what percentage components we have of different parts of air.
Hi! So today we're going to start talking about the respiratory system. Now, we should start talking about this by talking about what the purpose of the respiratory system is. So why do we have it? When we talked about the cardiovascular system, we mentioned how our closed circulatory system needs several places where it can exchange materials with the outside world. One of those was the digestive system, where we can bring in nutrients. One was the urinary system, where we can get rid of metabolic waste. And one was the respiratory system, where we could exchange gases. Mostly that's oxygen coming in and CO2 going out. So let's list some of our main purposes. The main one is gas exchange. And the things we're most concerned about are getting oxygen, O2 is the form that oxygen gas comes in, from the air to the blood. But just as important, we want to get carbon dioxide, the waste produced by aerobic metabolism, from the blood to the air. So that's really what we want to have happen as part of our respiratory system. Now, other gases will be exchanged. For example, a major component of air is nitrogen. Nitrogen will also be exchanged between air and blood. But nitrogen is physiologically inert for humans. It does nothing for us. It's not a toxin, it's not a nutrient, it's useless. So it dissolves in our blood and it comes out of our blood. We don't really worry about that too much unless you're scuba diving. And if you're scuba diving, you've probably heard of decompression sickness or the bends. And later on in one of these lectures, maybe we'll talk a little bit about that. But this gas exchange is the important thing for us right now. Now, we'll get to it. All right. One other function of our respiratory system is pH regulation. And that really comes as part of gas exchange. So, as it turns out, carbon dioxide plays a major role in regulating the pH of the blood on the acidity-alkalinity scale. And by using the respiratory system to control how much carbon dioxide is in my blood at any given moment, I can take a major role in changing the pH of my blood. So, for example, if I hold my breath for a while and don't get rid of CO2, the CO2 will build up in my blood, and that will actually make my blood more acidic. We talked about that in the bicarbonate buffer system when we talked in cardiovascular. Likewise, if I breathe more deeply and rapidly, I get rid of CO2 faster than my body is making it, which will actually reduce the amount of CO2 in my blood and make the pH more alkaline, make it higher. If you've ever hyperventilated and got kind of lightheaded as a result, the lightheadedness you get is actually a change from the pH change in your blood, not from extra oxygen, which is kind of interesting. But anyway, so these are really the two major features physiologically. There is a third function of the respiratory system which is important for us as a species, but not that important in terms of physiology. And as a hint, I'm doing it right now. Yes, sound production. So, if you think about humans as a species, the main things we have going for us have to do with our size, we're relatively fast, and we are smart. And part of using that smartness is the ability to communicate with each other. So there are many animals out there that communicate with sound. And there are some that do it in very sophisticated ways. But as far as we can tell, humans are the ones that use it to its greatest degree. Humans, by pushing air with our respiratory system through the larynx and then changing the tightness of some folds of tissue in the larynx, we can create sounds, tones from the larynx that we then shape using lips, tongue, teeth, cheeks, all of this stuff around here, into patterns of vibrations in the air, which then carry information to other humans. That when those patterns hit those other humans' eardrums, they vibrate the eardrums, through the mechanism of the ear, get translated into patterns of nerve signals, and those nerve signals are then turned into information in other people's brains. In other words, we talk, people listen. That's a really pretty cool thing that we can do, and it's useful for us. We can transmit information to other humans. Other creatures do this to varying degrees. I mean, there are plenty of creatures that have a call that's different for, hey, there's a predator up above versus, hey, there's a predator down below, because that might affect how you'd want to escape. And there are creatures like, say, some birds, elephants, probably cetaceans that use sound for very sophisticated communication. Humans just, we do it in a pretty interesting way and can carry a lot of info that way. So, sound regulation is one of the functions. So sound production, sorry. But it's not one that is extremely interesting physiologically, at least not for us right now. We'll talk about it a little bit when we talk about respiratory anatomy in the next part of the lecture. But right now, we're going to focus on gas exchange and pH regulation as a subsidiary function of that. All right, let's talk about gas exchange. Now, if we want to be able to move gases between air and blood, there are certain things that we have to make sure are arranged right. So let's talk about what has to be true in order to get effective exchange between blood and air. If you've ever kept fish, you probably in the fish tank had either a bubbler or some sort of jet or something that disturbed the surface of the water. The main reason you did that is to have more surface area of the water where gases could be exchanged. So one of the major features that we're going to need for this is having a lot of area for exchange. In humans, that's about, we have about 70 square meters of exchange surface. That's about a 25-foot square room. The floor of that is about how much space each of us has in order to exchange gases. So what does that surface look like? What do we have to have on that surface for it to work? So the respiratory exchange surface needs a very thin layer of blood. Thinner is better. And part of that is because the exchange only happens at the very surface of the blood. So if you had a deep layer of blood, the only part that's actually exchanging air is this very top part. Once gases get in there, they have to diffuse down through the rest of the blood, and that's fairly slow. So the thinner you can make it, the more effective and thorough your gas exchange will be. That needs to be separated from the air by some sort of thin membrane. We don't want the blood directly exposed to the air, because then we'd be losing water, for example. Also, we'd be exposed to any contaminants in the air. So we want something separating us from the air. And we need that membrane to be moist. Gases in the air do not dissolve into a phospholipid bilayer directly. Instead, they dissolve into this water and then diffuse through the water, through the phospholipid bilayer, and then into the blood. So we need a layer of water on top of that in order for gas exchange to work. So that's our exchange surface. We want a thin layer of blood with then a very, very thin membrane separating the blood from the air, and then a very thin layer of water on top of that membrane as a place for gases to move in and out of the air. So that's our exchange surface, and we need 70 square meters of that. So let's talk about how you could accomplish that. How could you get that much exchange surface, thin blood layer, thin membrane, kept moist, and have it do effective gas exchange? Well, let's talk about one way you could do it. So erase, and let's create a person. And I need to get a bunch of exchange surface on here. You know what would look cool? If we built something where we had a couple of structural pieces here at the shoulders, those kind of go up like this, and we put some sort of large surface out here, sort of a cape type thing. What we'll have is this person's heart here. We'll have it pump blood out onto this surface in a very thin layer. So there's my thin layer of blood. We'll encase it in a thin membrane. And we'll have something secreting water, some glands, like mucus glands or something, secreting water out onto that surface in a way that'll keep it moist. So there's our exchange surface. If you have this big enough, it could flutter dramatically behind you like a big old cape. And you've got this 25 feet square on each side membrane fluttering behind you as you walk dramatically in the breeze. And that's doing your gas exchange. Oxygen is dissolving into your blood on this big thing and then being brought back to your body, and CO2 is leaving your blood and going out into the air. So, would it work? Yeah, it might. There are creatures that do this. Not usually land-based creatures, but there are some aquatic creatures that have a sort of an external exchange membrane like this. Nudibranchs, a kind of sea slug, kind of work like this. So why don't we do this? What are the costs? What are the problems with this system? Let's see. First of all, it's unwieldy. Meaning it's large and kind of difficult to get around. If you wanted to go through a door, you have to gather it up behind you and then you can't breathe. If you can't stand very close to people, which in the current pandemic might be okay, but anyway, you get the idea. It's difficult, it's large and difficult to move around. Another problem is that it's fragile. Remember, in order for this to work, this has to be a super thin layer of blood separated from air by a super thin layer of tissue. We're talking thinner than tissue paper here. This would tear super easily. If this got caught on anything, it would rip right through it. It would probably have about the structural strength of wet toilet paper. So, this is way too fragile to have out exposed to the world like this, especially in an environment, in a terrestrial environment. Another issue is water loss. We're putting all of this water out here on the surface of this thing. Now, if you spread water out in a thin layer in the sun, what does it do? It evaporates really fast. What you've done here is make a way for you to get rid of body water really quickly by having this thin layer of water out on a surface exposed to the air and sun. That water's going to leave. There's no way you're going to keep this thing moist. So it's going to dry out almost instantly. Another, heat loss. You've effectively made yourself a blood radiator. All of that thin layer of blood out there is radiating heat out to the environment. So you're going to basically take on the same temperature as the environment very quickly. Your blood will, at least. Another one. We can call this the birds will poop on it problem. This is extremely vulnerable to infection. Anything out in the world that settles on this can get into your blood almost directly. So you're extremely vulnerable to the environment. Another one. We have no control over gas exchange in this case. I have no way of controlling how much CO2 leaves my blood here. Basically, it'll be as much as possible. I also can't control how much oxygen comes in. That's maybe less of a problem, but the CO2 issue is a big one because that affects the pH of our blood. So there's a whole list of issues with this. And there's even one more. Think about this. In this case, I don't need a vocal fold because I'm not actually moving air over anything. So this person probably is silent. They probably have no reason to have an organ for producing sound and no easy way to move air across it, even if they did. So there's a lot of problems with this. It would probably work for gas exchange, maybe even too well. So if this isn't how we do it, how do humans get that large exchange surface without these problems? Well, let's get rid of this weird idea. I'll leave my list of problems so we can determine if we've solved them. And how we do it. Instead of doing it this way, humans take our exchange surface and crinkle it up in a really complicated folded up pattern here inside our chest in two big bags, which we call lungs. So there's all of that surface crumpled up into a complicated folded up membrane inside these two big bags connected to the outside world with a tube. Now, does this solve our problem? Same amount of surface area. Is it easier to move around? Definitely. It's encased in our chest. It's within a relatively compact body. Is it fragile? Sure, it's still fragile. But is it protected? Yes. These lungs are held within the thoracic cavity, protected by tough membranes and bones. Do we still have a water loss issue? We do lose water when we exhale, but not nearly as much. Most of the moisture stays in here in these humid sacs in our chest. So we lose some air when we exhale. Some animals have better adaptations for avoiding that. Humans, we seem to be willing to lose some air with our exhalations. If you've read Dune, you know some technological solutions in science fiction for that, but different thing. Does it help with heat loss? Definitely. Most of the blood that's radiating heat just radiates it within the body. So yes, there's some warm air that we're exhaling, but it's not nearly as much as it would be in the other system. Is it better protected against infection? Definitely. The only way for infectious things to get to this is through this tube coming in. And so we can concentrate all our defenses around here to help protect that. It's more like having only one way that you can be attacked. Do we have control over gas exchange? Definitely. By controlling how often I move this air, I can control how much gas exchange I go through. And I get sound production back. That's nice. Since I'm going to have to be moving air through here, I can put my sound production organs right here, and I will definitely be able to use them to make sounds. So what's the cost? Well, the main one is that because I've put all this stuff inside my chest, I have to move air in and out over it. I have to do something to bring in fresh air and get rid of old air. In the other system, I don't have to breathe at all. I just let the fact that I'm out there in the air do gas exchange. Here, since that air is coming down a narrow pipe, I have to constantly push out old air and bring in new air. If I don't do that, I'll die. So the cost of doing it this way is that I have to devote muscles and some amount of brain processing to always be pumping that air in and out. And I can never stop, whether I'm awake or asleep or any other conditions. If I stop for very long, I will die. So that's the cost. I have to breathe. But of course that gives me the sound production as well, so, it's not all bad. All right, now let's talk about air. What is this stuff that I'm moving in and out of my lungs? Well, you probably already know it's a gas mixture. I know that for me, when I was a kid, one of the realizations I came to is that there is something there. Air is relatively transparent to light, so we look at it and it looks like empty space, but I don't know if you're anything like me, you spent a little time going, wait, I feel that. There's something there. This sense that there's something out there. It's kind of neat. Anyway, so air is a mixture of gases. Earth's atmosphere if we talk about what gases are in it, what do you think is the most prevalent gas in Earth's atmosphere? A lot of folks would say oxygen, but it's actually not. Our air is about 78% nitrogen. I should take a moment here. We're talking about dry air without any water vapor. We'll talk in a little bit about what water vapor does with this. So about 78% of our air is nitrogen gas, N2. And as I mentioned previously, what does nitrogen do for us? Nothing at all. Nitrogen is physiologically inert for humans. It doesn't do anything in our tissues. That's not to say we never worry about it. If you've ever done scuba diving, you know that if we dissolve enough nitrogen into our blood, when you're breathing air under pressure and then you release that pressure too fast, the nitrogen can come out in bubbles and cause serious problems. We'll talk about that a little later when we talk about partial pressures. But right now, the only other thing I wanted to say about this nitrogen is that while it's physiologically inert for us, that doesn't mean it's not important. If you remember looking at any of our biochemistry we did earlier, nitrogen is an important part of almost all of our biomolecules. DNA, proteins, ATP, all of that stuff has a lot of nitrogen in it. So how is this nitrogen getting used? If we can't use the nitrogen in the atmosphere, where does our nitrogen come from? You say, well, it comes in your food. Yes, but where'd they get it? And you go on down the food web until you find at the very base of the food web, there are certain bacteria, mostly bacteria, that live, a lot of them live in the roots of, symbiotically with the roots of plants, called nitrogen fixers. Those nitrogen fixing bacteria can take atmospheric nitrogen and metabolize it to turn into simple nitrogen-based compounds like ammonia, NH3, and a few others. Those nitrogen compounds are then used by other living things like the plants or the things that eat the plants and turned into other stuff. So all of that nitrogen in your DNA, in your protein, all of that came up the food web starting from those nitrogen-fixing bacteria mostly living around the roots of plants. So the fact that everything, pretty much the entire food web on Earth, depends on those nitrogen-fixing bacteria. Without them, we run out of nitrogen compounds, and a lot of our biochemistry depends on that. It's kind of interesting. Keep in mind, we need to be thankful for those bacteria. Anyway, but in terms of what's in the air for us, the nitrogen doesn't do anything. The next biggest component of air, making up about 21% of it, is oxygen. Oxygen, of course, is the stuff that we are breathing in order to get in. We use aerobic metabolism, and we talked extensively in the muscular system about exactly what that oxygen is for. We even mentioned how early on in the history of life, early things were all anaerobic. They didn't use oxygen because oxygen is so reactive that it was kind of a dangerous, toxic byproduct of early life. And as it built up in the atmosphere, a lot of organisms started getting poisoned by it until some of them figured out how to use it as part of their metabolism. Those became the first aerobic organisms. Your mitochondria, of course, are probably descendants of some of those early organisms. Anyway, so oxygen is about 21% of our air. Of the rest, that adds up to 99%. Of the rest, about 0.9% is the noble gas argon, which does nothing at all for us. Then there's about 0.04% carbon dioxide. That one is interesting. Carbon dioxide is the waste gas produced by many aerobic organisms. It's also what plants take in as their carbon source for making glucose in photosynthesis. Now, this number, within my lifetime in textbooks that I learned on even 10 years ago, was more like 0.03%. It's changed. It's gone up. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time right now on climate change, but what I will say is that while 0.03 to 0.04% doesn't seem like a lot, it is. It has large effects on the biosphere. It's not just that carbon dioxide is a heat-trapping gas in terms of global warming, which it is. It's that extra CO2 dissolves in the ocean and reacts with the water there to form carbonic acid, making the oceans just a little bit more acidic, which affects how certain creatures, like I believe diatoms and other plankton, can make They're little tiny shells or can do their biochemistry, which has huge impacts on the food web in general. So that 0.04% matters a lot. It's something we need to work on. In any case, going back to this, there's tiny bit of other stuff in there. That's mostly other noble gases like helium and neon. These are the ones that make up a noticeable amount of dry air. And of these, O2 and CO2 are the ones that we think that are important to us physiologically. Water vapor, if you add to the air, varies anywhere from about 0% to about 3% in very humid air. If that would just displace all of these others proportionally. So in air with a lot of water vapor, there's a little less of each of these, just so you know. We're mostly going to be talking about dry air in terms of these percentages. Now, those percentages are useful to know. We need to know that stuff. But if I want to talk about where gases are going to go, are they going to go from air to blood or blood to air? Percentages don't help me. We know that we need to talk about gases moving by pressure differences. So I'm going to need some way of translating these percentages into pressures in air. And that's going to be the idea of partial pressure, which we'll get to in the next segment of this.